Well, good.
In the bush. Hello, hello.
Hey, Tim. Righto, we're... Hey, Kate, how are you? Audio level? Where do you want me to go for an eye line there, or...? Yeah, righto. Yeah, good. Good morning. Welcome from inside this garden bed. Good to go. Testing 1, 2. David Crisafulli. Well, we're not standing here today because of figures that were released yesterday. We're standing here because of over half a decade of poor planning and mismanagement. And make no mistake, we are dealing with the biggest crisis for health in the nation's history. And if you look at the figures, we are in uncharted territory, and every Queenslander should be deeply concerned. For the first time, we can confirm not only is ramping figures the worst in the country, we now have the worst ambulance figures ever recorded. That is something that no state government should ever have on its watch. And for 42% of people who turn up across this state to wait longer than clinically recommended at the end of the ramp, that should be sending messages and shockwaves through the government. But it seems like they're not listening. And if you look at and analyse some of the figures across the network, it shows just how dire the situation is. 55% of people who turn up at Ipswich and QE2 aren't seen on time. 62% who turn up at Logan and the Redlands. But here at the PA, 67% of people who turn up wait longer than they should at the end of the ramp. Now, spare a thought for the doctors and nurses inside that place, scrambling to try and get people treatment. Spare a thought for the AMBO, who sits at the end of a ramp, waiting, hoping, while they know that somebody sits at the end of a phone line in their hour of need and they just can't get out and serve them. This is the reality of the Queensland health crisis and what we are dealing with. And today, the call to arms is to the Premier to show some leadership. Acknowledge we are in a crisis and fix it. And enough of the excuses. We heard them all rolled out yesterday, from floods to pandemics to people turning up. Well, the figures show that less people presented in this quarter than the last, and yet we've had the biggest spike in ambulance ramping. The government has to acknowledge there is a major problem, and it's not going to get better if they keep on denying there's an issue. This has been a health crisis over half a decade in the making, and it needs urgent action now. And we've put our solutions on the table: better resources, better data, better triaging, but above all, putting doctors and nurses back in charge. The Queensland health crisis is affecting everyday people every day, and the government has got to act, and they've got to act quickly. Over to you, Jarrod.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Jarrod, Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I want to reflect on a few of the issues in Parliament this week, and also the reality of the Queensland health crisis, which I've got to say the Bleijie government is not taking serious enough. They say their budget in a month's time is going to be a record budget. For goodness sake, every state budget handed down in the last 50 years has record health budget. So we're not going to cop this, we're going to have a record budget, because every state government budget is a record budget in health. And it should be this time too, because we have a real health crisis. I feel for the Queenslanders. 60% of Queenslanders in some of our hospitals stuck on the ambulance ramp, not getting into the and getting the care that they need. This is happening, it's real. And you see the arrogance of the Bleijie government just brushing aside these questions this week. Don't worry, it's all going to be right. It's not all right. The Premier and the Health Minister have got to get out of their offices in Brisbane and go to our towns, our communities, and see that this is real. It's happening and it's bad. People may not have thought that the health crisis under Anna Bleijie could have got any worse. Well, it has. It absolutely has. Under Bleijie's reign, ambulance ramping is the worst it has ever been in history. It is the worst in the country. It is the worst in the state. It is the worst government dealing with health in history. And I don't say that lightly. Under Anastasia's watch in 7 years, healthcare is the worst of any government in our history. At least Anna Bleijie had the courage to stand up and say and admit that under her watch the health system was broken. Anastasia Palaszczuk doesn't have that same commitment to the people of Queensland, because she is avoiding it and she's basically saying it'll all be right. Well, it's not. Tell that to a Queenslander stuck on an ambulance bed. I also want to deal with an issue yesterday with this fake transparency of the Leader of the House, who also is the Health Minister. They timed it all wrong yesterday. They botched it. They bungled it. They thought they got the opposition. The Health Minister stood up at the end of ministerial statements and announced that the health data had just suddenly been released. What they didn't count for was the fact that question time had been substantially delayed because of the tribute to a former Member of Parliament. So they got the timing all wrong. They were expecting the health data to be released during question time, and then the opposition wouldn't be able to see the data and ask questions in question time. Well, the one that controls that is generally the Leader of the House and the Health Minister. But it appears Yvette Darth didn't talk to herself, didn't look in the mirror and ask herself the question of the timing of Parliament. So what they were trying to do is hide the fact that the figures were going to be released during question time. But because they botched the timing up, the figures were actually released before question time because question time was delayed. And that gave the opposition the opportunity to see the huge increase in ambulance ramping across the state. So it was fake transparency. They don't even hide the fact now that they're trying to hide these figures. They don't even hide the fact that they don't want people to see these terrible health statistics. And every time we see a statistic, we're talking about a person. Talk about 42% statewide ambulance ramping. You're talking about nearly half of Queensland's population stuck on stretchers. The third thing I want to talk about is Cameron Dick. Now, Spur. Over 10,000 people in Queensland received wrong notices and fines. Their details, their private details, were released to the public, to other members of the public. This is a huge issue. And he laughed it off yesterday. The Treasurer, the most arrogant Treasurer we've had in the state, laughed it off in Parliament yesterday. We're talking about over 10,000 Queenslanders' private details being released. How would he like the fact, if his private details were ever released, the fact that this guy says he represents and lives in Woodridge, but it turns out he probably doesn't live in Woodridge? How would he like his personal details released to the rest of the public? And Treasurer Cameron Dick's private details get sent to someone else? He wouldn't. No one would. And instead of owning up to the fact yesterday that his Department of Treasury bungled it and botched it, he just deflected like he always does. But this guy, Cameron Dick, has form in this regard. He was the Attorney General under the Bleijie government that tried to hide the blowout in Spur debt. Nearly $1 billion in blowout under Cameron Dick's watch when he was the AG. And he tried to hide it. There was an ethics investigation into him which found that he did, in fact, try and hide the details from the Queensland public. So he should apologise. He should apologise to the people of Queensland. There are over 10,000 people that had their private details released, unauthorised release of their private details. And what did he say yesterday? He doesn't lick the stamps. Well, that's good to know in COVID. He doesn't lick the stamps and he doesn't write the letters. But what he should do is run proper administration. What he should do is apologise, because ultimately he is responsible for the Treasury Department and Spur. It happened under his watch and he should apologise. And finally, can I make this comment about Anastasia Palaszczuk completely giving up on regional and rural Queensland? A by-election in Callide was called on Monday. Nominations for candidates close next Monday, in a few days' time. Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Labor Party, have not announced a Labor candidate for the seat of Callide. And it begs the question, why? Why would they give up on the bush? Why would they give up on regional and rural Queensland? And I'll tell you why. Because they're embarrassed by their record. They're embarrassed by the $1 billion of infrastructure cuts in central Queensland. They're embarrassed by the fact there's been over $3 billion budget blowouts under Mark Bailey that could go into better roads in regional and rural Queensland. They're embarrassed by the fact that they've closed maternity services in rural and regional Queensland, where women are giving birth to babies on the side of the road. They're embarrassed by their record, and I suspect that's why they're not running a candidate in Callide. they have given up. But imagine if you were a Labor Party, long-life Labor Party voter in that area and go to election day not having someone that believes in your values to vote for. Well, I say to the people of Callide in rural and regional Queensland, your government, the Palaszczuk Labor government, has given up on you. And the only way you can send a message to Anastasia in Brisbane, and it's not acceptable that they're not sending a candidate in Callide, putting a local up for the Labor Party, is to vote for our great candidate, Bryson Head, LMP. Great local who will do a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you for questions.
Obviously, David, the government says it's a national crisis with evidence ramping. We do see bad things happening in New South Wales and Victoria. So what's your response?
But nowhere else are we seeing figures like this. We are breaking health records for all the wrong reasons. And to think that there's a hospital here where people rely on and 2 in 3 people wait at the end of a ramp longer than they should, no government should be proud of that, and no Queenslander should have to experience it. And I'm sorry, but yesterday there was a myriad of excuses as to why this is the case. No other state is at 42% ambulance ramping. No other state has the waiting list that we experience. And to think that this data was withheld for nearly half a year, and when it comes out, it shows the state of our health system is far worse than we thought. Well, that goes to the heart of the issue. If you're not willing to admit there's a problem and you're not willing to stop the blame game, it's never going to get fixed, and that is deeply troubling. It's tragic, and we met with, myself and Mark Boothman met with a woman the other day on the northern part of the Gold Coast who's experiencing the same thing. And we have a crisis of housing, and whenever I go around the state listening, it's something that is raised with me, not just by the groups who are trying to place the vulnerable, but also business who can't attract people into regions because there's just no housing for them. And there's a couple of things that need to happen, and they need to happen quickly. One is we've got to find a way to get more land to the market, and that involves the government delivering infrastructure to open up new opportunities. But we also have to get serious about building social housing and unleashing affordable housing with the market so that those who are vulnerable are able to go into that. That then will stop the pressure that we're experiencing at the bottom end of the market. But it is a crisis, and we have working families who are living in a tent because of poor planning and a lack of affordable housing. No society should have that on their watch. We'd like to see the fund that was announced last year that didn't have $1 attached to it actually be real this year and not trickery. Because you can announce funds and put names beside them, but if there's no real money attached, it's not going to help a single person get into a house. And you only have to have a look at the vacancy rates across regional Queensland. You only have to have a look at the price that people are having to pay to get a roof over their head to know that this is now a crisis of the working class. People who go to work and still can't afford to put a roof over their kids' heads. That is unacceptable. And if you look and analyse the amount of land that has been released, last year was the first time in over half a decade that it hasn't seen a decrease. Now, that's an issue. That's an issue with not developing infrastructure to allow new lots, and it is an issue with a state government that has produced less affordable housing than the growth of population. It's been less than 1% over the last half a decade, a net increase of less than 1% at a time when our population has exploded. That is another example of poor planning. People are living it on the back of a ramp here, and they're living it in a tent across centres throughout this state. Poor planning affects everyday people every day.
The Premier talks about this so-called massive spend for health budget. What is that budget that needs to appear?
Well, the AMAQ has said that we are 1,500 beds short, and I don't think that's an ambit claim. If anything, one could argue that's a little bit skinny. We have a dire under-resourcing, and it is affecting people at the coalface. There are some things the government could do immediately, and one of them is putting doctors and nurses back in charge, sharing data in real time, making sure that the triaging is improved. But we do have an issue with resources. Now, in the election campaign, the Premier made it very much about funding from Canberra. So she said that we'd see a 50-50 funding deal, and we'd welcome that. But at the end of it, the state government administers health services, and we've seen over half a decade of decline. And we are in uncharted waters when it comes to the health crisis in this state. Ambulance ramping is the worst in the nation, and it is the worst on record. Surely that is cause for alarm. We would stand ready to make whatever amendment it needs. And my message to the government is, if they are serious about democracy, they would be serious about a free press. We live in a society where, more than ever, we need journalists to be able to do their job without the fear of the heavy hand of the law. And I'm not comfortable with the way that democracy is run in this state at the moment. And if the government refuses to find a way to give journalists the protection that they deserve, it is another nail in the coffin for transparency and integrity. And we've seen too much of that. In its third term, the government isn't the same government it was when it promised to be open and transparent over 7 years ago. And every journo deserves to go to work, be able to do their job, hold those with power to account, and not have a heavy hand of the law breathing down their neck. And we'll stand up for those values every day of the week.
Any other questions? Have a great day, guys.
Thanks very much, guys. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.